Good evening, everyone. Request everyone to please be seated. May I request our speakers to please come up on stage? Thank you all very much for joining us today for our fifth session under the G20 Summit series, Amplifying the Voice of the Global South. We are truly pleased to have with us today our eminent panelists who will be talking to us about this important subject. Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, Ms. Archana Vyas, and our moderator for today, Mr. Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, who is an adjunct faculty member at the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication and a consulting editor at the Business Standard. We really look forward to an extremely insightful discussion with today. And with that, I now hand over the floor to you, Mr. Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. Thank you.
Thank you. The first thing one does once is to use a good bit of specs. And I just changed mine today. Because both Ambassador Gurjeet Singh and Archana, I want to ask you some very tough questions because this is an audience that knows a hell of a lot about what India is doing and what India is not doing, and especially issues that's now possibly, surprisingly have become the bone of contention, what is that of global South and North. In fact, I had always thought when we were studying in colleges that by that time, we would have read about it and would have gone on and other issues would take over. Now at this stage, when global South and global becomes a topic of discussion, you wonder whether we have really moved the development agenda or any agenda for that matter in the past 30 years, which roughly is my working career. So you can guess, because that is where we would have thought that by now it would have been a matter of very easy consensus. And the biggest challenge that I see is that those who are now the global South are also a part of what is called what I call the New South, which is essentially a group of very powerful countries, and I refer to Brazil, India, Russia, China, as the countries which are deciding a lot of global agenda. And that is the new fracture point, according to me, in the global discourse, which needs to be addressed properly. Unless this is the moving plate in the entire global architecture, and unless this gets resolved, I do not expect a clarity of where the new global relations will work out. But on that note, Ambassador, you are the one who's been writing a lot, and especially I know that your understanding of issues regarding Africa is particularly significant. So today, I just want to ask that the way India of NAM used to look at Africa, is it the same way that we are now addressing, and I'm particularly referring to Africa, as the same way in 2023 vis-a-vis Global South?
Thank you. A very good afternoon to you all, and thank you, Ananta Center, for inviting us. I'm very happy to be among such eminent people from whom I will certainly learn something today. So you broadly asked me three questions. So the last one was, are we looking at Africa the way we looked at Africa in NAM? So before I answer that, Africa is not looking at us like they looked at in NAM. Let's be clear on that. Why? When India of the leader of NAM was the identity ticket for countries being decolonized. So you came out with three identities in Africa: the United Nations, the Organization of African Unity, and the non-aligned movement. for which you approached India and Egypt and Indonesia. Okay. But today, there is no identity. You got your identity. In between, you African countries who wanted to join the WTO, for instance, they all came to India. But today, there is no such identity to be obtained. What you need to obtain is your development. So, today, for most countries, your relationship with anybody is as good as what's the last thing they did for you. It is about that transaction. And anybody who says that I'm ideologically inclined, even let's say India to Africa, it is good for a speech. In reality, it doesn't matter. The second question you asked me was that why the global south today? Yes, certainly the requirements of the global south for its development agenda have failed. 30 years is a long time. But in these 30 years, I have seen the south dissipate, and many parts of the south work effectively with the north. So whether you work with G7 countries or you work with China in the BRI, everybody was making their own deal. I have been ambassador to the African Union, I have been ambassador to ASEAN. So they are both entities of the South. And I know that they are riveted with different interests. Some in Africa think the French are great. On the other side, they think they are the biggest troublemakers. So everybody has their own view. And China is part of this problem. So I don't agree with you that China and Russia are part of the New South. They are part of the problem why there is a New South. China's BRI is not egalitarian. It does not support the South. China has never been part of any South institution. Even in 1964, it was always the G77 and China, and that's where it remains, and China. It is never a part of any. But why are we looking at the global South? Because with the cleavages and the big power rivalry which has come back in a big way, we realize that the Russians, even if they want to be your friend, are basically shot themselves in the foot. If you want the Americans to be your friends, they are friends up to a point. For instance, in the Indo-Pacific, they are your friends. In Afghanistan, they are not. So you have to find your way out. So there, I think India believes that if you want to stand up of your own, and our agenda is in common with many countries of the South, we should become the voice of the global South. So I think everybody will look at India as a country which resurrected NAM as the global South. Thank you.
Ambassador, you actually made my job very easy because these often don't get articulated clearly in many of these discussions. And it's so wonderful, refreshing to hear from you, because India is now the G20 president. Next year, it will be Brazil. After that, it will be South Africa. Now, obviously, there is no way that we can say that, given also the fact that Asia is now the place where most of the world's growing economies are located, and this particular area is going to be, what I should say, the most coveted the most strongest tussle points. Because if I look at all the issues that is going to come up, and of that, of course, there are lots of issues like the health, which is where I'll be bringing along Archana. But before that, there's also the issue of critical mineral supply, where I see a new series of flashpoints emerging, because their combination and those are distributed in such a way that there's no way, given the way the world is moving towards renewable energy, that these will not be the new challenges. So there are plenty that's already coming up to add to already the tension that you're pointing out. So Archana, you are, and I mean, as the Deputy Director Advocacy Communications of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you are what I should say, the one who handles a peace flag in all these areas. And you are the person who's, I mean, and this is the organization which has yet been part of a very enormous challenge which we have faced over the last 2 years. Health was considered a primary issue of the South, which is still there. But the big issue that is coming up with health is that of, which I want to bring in right now, is that of technology. When technology gets into health, is the global South in an advantageous position to handle it? Does the cost of health become something which can actually become a new fracture point in the South?
Thanks, and thanks to my co-panelists. As he said before, I'm going to learn a lot, and I've already from your first answer learned quite a bit in terms of how India can be the voice of global South, and the geopolitics that is so accentuated at this point in time. Before I get to technology, Shubhamoy, I think you're absolutely right that. As an organization at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we are focused on reducing inequities. Unfortunately, a lot of inequities, whether it comes to health and development, actually sit in global South. But tremendous progress has been made. We have to acknowledge that over the last 20 years, I mean, if I look at data, maternal mortality from 2000 to now, it's been cut by over 34%. Infant mortality has been cut by over more than 60% in India as well as globally from 1990. Health doesn't tend to be a political priority. I mean, that's what we've struggled with over so many years. Fortunately, unfortunately, because of COVID, everything changed, right? It was so for the first time, it was so important for countries to realize that health actually transcends boundaries, and no one is safe till everybody is safe. I mean, that's what we heard during COVID, right? Um, good things happened while there was COVID. There were global collaborations that emerged inequitably, I should say that. But still, there were global collaborations, and with R&D, with other vaccine manufacturers who were, especially in India, which is something that we supported, were able to supply not only for India. Well, there was a point in between because of obviously the second wave, which was so drastic for India, but otherwise providing support to other parts of the world. So I would say technology and innovations, India definitely has a role to play. Um, we support vaccine manufacturing quite a bit in India, and about 60% of vaccines that are delivered by Gavi across the world are actually manufactured in India. We work with Serum, we work with Bharat Biotech, we work with BioE. Not only are they saving lives in India, but they're also saving lives across the world. So innovations, I would definitely say India on global health. Vaccines show short. India has a role to play. Likewise, on diagnostics coming out of COVID, if you look at RT-PCR in US was so expensive. If you look at RT-PCR in India, it was so cheap. Everybody got an RT-PCR test. Diagnostics are now getting fueled, and innovations in diagnostics are getting fueled in India for the world. At the same time, now coming to digital, India is an exemplar for the world. Digital public infrastructure on which financial inclusion has been built it is phenomenal because you're thinking about ID. There are foundational structures in place. India built its own financial inclusion on public infrastructure, on top of which innovations have taken place. The same infrastructure, which is on ID as well as data exchange, which is the same infrastructure or similar principles of those infrastructure, is being used for health, whether it is the CoWIN platform now that is being used for routine immunization purposes as well. On digital innovation, India is a stellar example, and the same infrastructure is now being used for education. The same principles. When I say same infrastructure, it's the same principle that is being used for accelerating digital education, which can actually help solve for Africa. So many countries that are looking at digital technology to bridge the gap of education, but also for agriculture as well. So I think innovations is India has a role to play, but also other countries like Brazil has a fantastic platform for financial inclusion, similar principles. It's called PIX. We also work with academic institutions in Africa, Carnegie in Rwanda. They're looking at digital ID. They're looking at data exchange. I think within Global South there is great appetite, but also from India there are examples that can be shared with the world. There can be diffusion of lessons, which is what we are excited about. That how, as Gates Foundation, which tends to be agnostic of any politics and tends to focus a lot more on people and tends to focus on vulnerable populations in terms of how can we help accelerate the solutions so that the social development as well as SDGs accelerate.
That's fantastic. Before I go to the ambassador, I just wanted to ask you one thing. Considering, as you said, India is the producer of large number of the technological innovations that's coming. The Global South is also the consumer. How do you see this relationship? The initial part has been a lot of what I might call reaching out to countries, helping out in the initial flush. But when a more sustained long-term relationship takes place, how do you see the architecture going forward?
So in terms of one, I would say that from our work and the work that we've done in health and development, first of all, India provides the scale. It just provides the scale of implementation, which is so attractive to other countries in terms of, you worked in, we work a lot in UP and Bihar that are like countries in themselves. Interventions that work in UP and Bihar already are scaled examples for the world. I think there are different pathways in terms of when you're talking about, long-term sustained diffusion mechanisms, if that's what you were asking about, something that we were discussing earlier. Well, one could work with government-to-government partnerships. We have a partner ecosystem that helps diffuse, which is agnostic of the government as well. But there are regional platforms, regional groupings that are available that can be strengthened, right? ASEAN, AU, and working with these regional groupings can offer pathways of sustained knowledge sharing and diffusion as well. So there are different pathways that the foundation looks at and is exploring as well, because we tend to work a lot through the partners, but we're thinking about more sustained, more institutionalized ways of making sure that the lessons that we're learning can be exchanged both ways, right? India can take the lessons, but also other countries can take those lessons, working through institutional structures that are available. And how can we support these institutional structures so that issues are elevated and discussed and debated?
Right. Thank you for that. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed talking with you and with Ambassador Singh is that you're both from tales from the trenches of the Global South, of really working on issues that matter instead of just the 36,000 feet. Look at what are the issues there, and that's very significant. Which is why I want to bring out that points that you raised about the cooperational aspect. And now let me take the example a bit further. When we look at the entire range of agenda that's being talked about, food security, livelihood, energy, and all that, in all of these issues that's now being flagged at the G20, a critical role that comes in in negotiating and helping this dialogue along was the role of the multilateral institutions, the forums where many of these discussions is to take place. But this is something where the global dialogue today is possibly not at its full, what I should say, full blast. So, what is it that you think needs to be the course correction to make these come and achieve center stage in these dialogues?
Thank you. So, just building on what Archana said, and what you just asked. So, thanks to COVID, vaccines became in demand. And despite our own difficulties, the reaction we got to receiving Indian vaccines in Africa and ASEAN, for instance, woke us up that vaccine diplomacy has many more ramifications than simply a vaccine. So I think this reawakening of the global south owes much to vaccine diplomacy. Second, the Ukraine crisis created three major uh, disruptions: fuel, fertilizer, and food. Now, fertilizer, we haven't been able to do much, but both for Africa and ASEAN, India has been the alternative to Ukraine to buy food grain or rice. And where fuel is concerned, the large refineries in India are today making refined petroleum the largest item of India's exports in India's neighborhood on both sides. So these have made significant changes to our engagement with Africa and ASEAN on two sides of the Indian Ocean. And these came about because of the two crises. So the world system of talking to each other is broken. But also broken are the regional bodies. The African Union is not what it used to be. ASEAN is not united. Their unity is constantly under threat, and not only on one issue, on several issues. So, what does the United Nations Security Council do when confronted, let us say, with the Ethiopian civil war in Tigray or the Myanmar massacres? They say these are very bad things, and we ask the respective regional organizations to take charge, knowing full well that neither the AU nor ASEAN will be able to act there. So, abdication is the prime motivation of international organizations today. WTO abdicates on dispute settlement because the Americans won't let you have it. That is why during the Modi visit, you notice India has withdrawn, and the US. All the disputes that we had, realizing that this dispute settlement mechanism is not going to happen. So we will find a bilateral way of doing it. So WTO is broke. WHO, the Chinese, twisted their arms. So that is broke. So what is working? The regional organization, nothing is working. So what would
Only
we
one
do?
working is Ananta Center. This is the only place where we can have a discussion.
No, so what? So now it's easy to laugh it off, but what can we do? India has a good network of regional arrangements across the globe, from Latin America to the Pacific. Slowly, if you notice this year, despite the busy diplomatic calendar, these are being revived. Prime Minister actually held FIPIC. Jaishankar, the minister, actually went to CARICOM and the Central Americans. The Africa summit may actually happen this year. ASEAN happens every year. Central Asia Forum is the one which most of them came to SCO, but it's not the same thing. So we are engaged. What more should we do? On the ASEAN side, we should recognize that its unity is broken. We should pick on those countries who are ready to work with us on our agenda. And all 10 are not on the same page. The recent visit of the Philippines FM, I think clearly showed you who is ready and who's not. On the African side, it is totally uneven. So why don't we start working with the regional bodies? Why doesn't India, ECOWAS, have Economic Commission for West African states, 15 countries? Do something with them. Do something with East African community who's the most active. And that way you will perhaps encourage other parts of Africa to invigorate your own regional bodies, like in the Arab Maghreb Union. But everything is not even. So, being faced with an uneven world, we should not try to fix the world, just work unevenly with it, ride like a surfer. When the wave is right, you ride it. When it is not, you let it be. We are not a superpower. Thank you.
I'm surprised you didn't refer to the cheetahs. That's you didn't refer to that cheetahs. That's coming from Namibia. Very useful ones to have, and I realize that they are could be a good metaphor of the way relationships could be built. But you pointed out that the continental institutions are not working, yet at this stage, when the global south is the center of practically every major issue, including, as I said, and I was particularly referring in the stage to the critical minerals, health we already have, all of these, then are we saying that we need a different set of institutions, or do we sort of try to re-engage with the institutions, or sort of set the agenda differently or the constitution differently?
I think India needs to get involved in current institutions in a manner that we lay out the priorities. So, therefore, the new development bank is not an example. It is a failed example. Or the AIIB, the Chinese lay out all the priorities. So, if we agree to a BRICS expansion, I think that's a good move. You may be able to get some countries in who will not kowtow to China all the time. So at the moment, Russia, China, and South Africa are making India and Brazil run helter-skelter. So if you go to 10, maybe you will get at least 3 more who will not. China and Russia will get 1 friend each. But we should also have friends. We get them in and maybe we try and balance it. Then we make them contribute to the new development bank and make sure it meets our objectives. I have been writing a lot that you mentioned right in the beginning, India, Brazil, South Africa. Don't forget Indonesia before us. So 4 countries of the global south in a row. Very propitious. Now, why can't we come together and create our own fund? It doesn't have to be a large fund. It can be an impact investment fund to achieve the SDGs. But the priority setting should be by us, not by the G7, not by China, not by anybody telling us what to do. We know what to do. As she has said, we do it, and we do it to scale. So we need to put our heads together in the global south. Easier said than done. Even you ask South Africa which African country they like, they will not tell you. Do we want a South Asian country into BRICS? No. So these are the contradictions. So as I said, work with the willing, do what they are willing. In Africa, for instance, she has said, vaccine production. In Western Africa, meningitis was removed because of Indian vaccines. HIV/AIDS in Africa is under control because we busted the system. We have been supported a lot by civil society organizations like them and others who were the biggest votaries for Indian pharmaceuticals in Africa, much more than any promotional effort. Why doesn't India work with partners to set up vaccine manufacturing for COVID in African countries? The Germans put together $250,000, 250 million euros. But do they want to part with their technology? No. So we should be ready. The Americans told South Africa, we'll give you a factory. That doesn't work. Look, that is why the South Africans are screaming. So we need to do something which is limited but deliver. That will make whatever you do valuable, institution or no institution. Thank you.
Actually, the ambassador pointed out a very important thing, which at least I thought is that in the global south, the agenda or the ability of countries to set agenda is becoming very difficult. And one of the major issues that we are figuring out here is the issue of trust of the countries together. Now, putting on your, looking at it from the health perspective, we is there a set of what should I say, agenda that can be set up as a non-partisan, or a sort of say across countries, which countries will agree is something that they will be willing to work on? Like, for instance, the way success we have had on health, can that be transmuted to say environmental issues? Or would the fractures again sort of tend to dominate the discussion?
So first of all, I think what gives me hope and enthusiasm and optimism is the way the world got together as far as COVID is concerned. There, one would have not thought about technology transfers, open sharing of, IPs as well, but that happened, right, during COVID, because the world was coming together in terms of reducing mitigation to the pandemic. And I think we need to build on that. There is a greater understanding that surveillance, data sharing, uh, trust, trust with data sharing is important and critical. At the same time, this is the time when there are conversations that are happening in terms of even harmonized regulatory processes within the global south, right? Because if there were really issues around countries being left out because they did not have vaccines, there is heightened awareness that you know there should be harmonized surveillance, there should be harmonized clinical essays, there should be harmonized um, you know regulatory processes, because that would make global south move faster. These are important issues. These are important issues that need to be discussed as well. But I think there is greater openness. One of the areas that we support in G20 is, one of the key priorities that India is putting forward is really digital public infrastructure. And that is being led by METI, which is Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Now, 19 out of the 20 countries are actually saying digital public infrastructure is important. The recognition has never happened before. 19 out of 20 countries saying it's important. India put it on the agenda. It took time to negotiate, but the countries are moving, saying it is important. Data sharing is important, right? Um, at the same time, you know, there are discussions that are happening around building an alliance so that this data sharing can happen in a structured manner. There is a possibility that this alliance comes through. The contours may be decided later, the TORs may be decided later, but at the same time, with the help of partners, with the help of technical experts, I think we are progressing, and these are critical issues. Related to environment, which is what you said, just like you said, the 3 Fs, there are 3 Cs. Well, there is the fact there was COVID, and then the climate, which is related to environment, that has had an impact more so on, again, the cohort that we work with, which is the small farmers and small landholding farmers. They have been impacted dramatically. Women have been impacted dramatically, and there is issue of food security. There.
So you think that there's an agenda building that's happening in the global south despite the differences?
It's not even global south, it's global north and global south. I mean, in the sense that Gates Foundation is actually worried that climate and AI technology, AI and climate are actually hogging the limelight, so to say, taking away the agenda from global health, which is so important, right? Women and children die every day because of global health inequities. But climate is really top of the agenda. But again, climate is inequitable, right? The global north sets the agenda on mitigation and innovation, whereas countries in global south, they need to grow as well. And therefore the agenda is differentiated, and the agenda needs to be differentiated, which is to say that a country like India or Brazil may be thinking about climate adaptation along with mitigation, and not necessarily mitigation, because the countries need to grow, and that is true.
So, in that context, Ambassador, the agenda setting as a, we are talking about amplifying the voice of the global south. Are you now convinced, or is it that the agenda, who sets the agenda, also determines the amplitude of the voice? That there is the global south on the negotiating table in adequate number and in strength to be able to decide on the agenda.
So you need to add not only who sits at the table, but he who provides the finance. That is the determinant. Why has the North not succeeded in bullying everybody so far on the climate agenda? It's because they haven't put up the money. Had they put out the money, they would have twisted everybody's arm by now. What they have succeeded in doing is being divisive on the global south. So they will try and tell the LDCs that these Indians and these Brazilians are separate from you. They will tell the small island development state, you are separate. Those guys actually now believe they are separate. So everywhere the SIDS keep coming up. This is a creation out of this, not out of the WTO. It's out of the climate. Climate agenda has been the worst for the global south. The climate agenda should have been negotiated in Nairobi by UNEP. But the West never reconciled that an UN headquarters was in a global south. They whittled away all these conventions out of the UNEP and took it to Montreal and Basel and Bonn and wherever, emasculating UNEP, which would have been the lead factor. Then all the money is put into these organizations, the conventions, not in the UNEP. But they are not getting their way because the biggest threat was that the Americans and the Chinese would make a deal. But somewhere we have succeeded in exposing that. So the bulk of the global south today is worry of China in taking promises which will impinge on them. So the climate agenda is messing up our lives, dividing the world, and today it is the fifth most divisive agenda on the G20, the first four being Russia. So once you're finished with that, you will come to global health and stuff which is important to the global south. And this is what India is trying to do. Saying whatever you want to say on these divisive, you please say, but let us do what is important to us. And I think that is where India's summit will be a success. Thank you.
And no, and I agree with the ambassador. What India is doing is really putting out a strong agenda on G20. The the most important agenda that the country is putting forward is SDGs. They're saying this is the midpoint, and we have to go back and assess ourselves in terms of where countries are with respect to achievement of those goals and how the acceleration post pandemic needs to be done. So the pace of acceleration has to be even faster to make up for the lost ground. So that is core and central to the G20 agenda, and which is extremely powerful, because you could have been dominated by agenda which is like focused on energy. As I'm not saying that's not there, but very strong agenda on SDG, very strong agenda on women led development. Well, the G20 countries are divided on women led development. Very strong agenda on climate, which is linked to even MDB reforms and the way the global financing architecture needs to be seen and needs to be re-architected so that it accelerates the SDGs along with the financing needs, which are very differentiated by countries, as well as the digital public infrastructure. So I think it is a strong agenda, and I really hope that the countries are supporting, because these are fundamental to growth.
that makes me rather concerned that in this G20, as well as it happened in G20 Indonesia, almost none of the working groups, in fact, not almost all of the working groups, have not been able to come out with the declarations. It's basically been the chair's communique. Now, where, as well as crafted as those communiques could be, the point still remains that those are not the concerted, cooperative, finally agreed agenda to be put on the table of the world opinion. Given if that sort of a situation continues, and in Brazil, then where does the role, or who or which entity would be responsible for setting up a common agenda on some of the issues which we now realize is probably as significant? Forget about I mean, not just climate, but practically anything, even on health. We have a chair's communique even on health. That does not make me very confident about the coming together of the interested parties. Russia, every reason, whatever. So where do you go from here?
So I think up to a point, India tried to see whether a common agreement was possible. I think as more and more ministerials happened, it became evident that these two paragraphs will continue to divide us because the Ukraine war has not gone the way everybody anticipated in Bali. The situation is not the same. So the Russians will not bow down. So they will stand up. So this will not happen. So either you keep dealing with this and you expend huge diplomatic capital in negotiating around these issues simply to get a functional communique out. So I think India has taken the right decision that let this be. I'm not going to get a consensus. I will go with the chair summary on which there is broad agreement except on maybe 2, 3 paragraphs. Like she said, even on health, one country stands out. It's not that everything has a 2020 consensus. But I think that is where India decided that we have some diplomatic capital. And they decided to use it to bring the African Union into the aid. You see, the decision is pretty recent. I think that is when I think that the conclusion was that I'm not wasting my time trying to persuade everybody on Ukraine. I have met Zelensky in Hiroshima. I am done. Now I want to run my G20. And if I'm going to speak for the Global South, I want the largest number of Global South, 54 countries of Africa, to be sitting there as in. So they have been sitting there, but not the way we want. So I think we have decided let us pursue an objective which we can achieve rather than bang our heads on something we want. But I don't think the broader issue in the future also, you said what happens. So I don't think the G20 anymore is going to run on 100% consensus. It is going to run in the future on largely agreeable issues. And that is the way the world is. Thank
As long as there's a solid agenda that's being discussed, right? I mean, there's a lot of energy that goes behind the G20, the 4 working group, I mean, the 3 working groups, and then you have the ministerial meeting, and there's a lot of time across the G20 heads being spent. So as long as you have a strong agenda, which I think is being discussed, and even Indonesia had some very strong issues, at least in the areas that we support, I think well, the communique is a communique, as ambassador would know. Of course, you desire for a leader's communique, but an outcome document which is strong enough, which also calls out well the 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 geopolitics. I think it is a good outcome, right? Yeah. So it's
No, sorry, I want to
Yeah,
come in here.
yeah.
You have, if you're supposing you have an outcome document on women,
yeah.
right? And then you have a jarring subject that the Russians are bad. It doesn't make any difference to the agenda. I mean, you can keep saying Russians are bad. Why does it make a difference to the women of the world? Except those who are suffering there. So I think we need to understand that your consensus 100% is no more possible.
And we don't get a mention about what's happening in Afghanistan, where it would have been much more relevant. But in that context, before I open it up for the audience, there's just one thing that I thought I'll ask you, Archana, that you represent an organization which is also hugely respected across lots of countries, and in this not just G20 but in several other places where there's agenda setting, there's a lot of background work that goes on. Has your, I mean, looking at it from your experience, has the, I mean, how does it look like? Is the work of bringing people becoming more difficult, or is it the same, or is there more, I mean how is the pattern changing?
Well, we
It's like going behind that.
First of all, we are a non-partisan organization, right? We work with agnostic of any political party. We just the fundamental is that the DNA of the organization is about reducing inequities. Fortunately for us, we do find a lot of acceptance. I can't even tell you that I thought it was overestimation of our capabilities. The number of calls that we were receiving from across countries during COVID, and the foundation worked incredibly hard because it was a tough situation. But it just tells you how much people trust you for the work that you do. I and it was a huge a matter of huge responsibility in terms of coming up with that response from all fronts, from R&D, but also supporting governments on the front line, and also dealing with issues such as vaccine hesitancy, working with frontline health workers at a time when there was no communication that was possible, especially during lockdown. So the foundation does pride itself in looking at data and evidence. So what we had done at that point in time is almost look at pandemic like situation, because we'd supported governments during Ebola, especially Africa. Like, what are those models that work at the time of pandemic, and what are those evidence-based models that we can take to countries so that their response is stronger. uh, Also, the fact that we are data centered makes us even more objective, because if something is not working, then you can put out data in front of the governments and our partners, which could be private sector, which could be research organizations, to have a very healthy conversation in terms of what's working and what's not working. Um, we are a solutions oriented organization, so even if we look at very hard problems that are not being solved by the world, or that those problems that are being left behind for people who are being left behind, we tend to look for solutions, and we tend to look for, rather than just gazing at the problem and actually looking at the problem because the problem's looking really nice, we actually roll up our sleeves and try and look for those solutions that can help solve for those. So I think the combination of data centricity and solution orientedness makes us unique as well as acceptable organization. But at the same time, we are hugely privileged, and which is what I think, it's a huge position of privilege that we are surrounded by such rich organizations and other partners who have so much to deliver and who actually make our work easier and stronger.
Thanks, but I was wondering, like, you'd say something like what the problems of shepherding countries is like our problems that we used to have shepherding the school children's across those, with each one so different priorities and the challenges that used to happen.
The
Archana and I, we
country
being part of
does,
the same school network, and I was thinking that that's probably where.
No, so one thing that I should tell you, that Melinda would remind us again and again, and this is an advice that she received from Warren, is that, like, the priority, I mean, whichever country that we work in, the priorities are set by the countries, right? If you come in with an agenda, you'll not be acceptable. So, working with India, on its own issues and its own priorities, makes us easier to think about how you want to solve the problems for that country rather than thinking from outside.
Right.
Yeah.
I should have made the announcement at the beginning, but the point is that it is, I mean, it was supposed to happen. I was expecting it to make it more interactive, but yeah, I would love to get the comments from this distinguished audience. So please just identify yourself, and yeah, there's a mic, I think, reasonably handy. So just identify yourself and to whom you want to
Sure.
ask.
I'm Vidur. I'm interning with the Ananta Aspen Center, and I'm sorry. I think I'm probably the least kind of qualified to be asking a question in this room, but still, I had something in mind for you, Ambassador Gurjeet. Um, when we are holding a session about talking about amplifying the voice of the global South, and you particularly mentioned India kind of taking the lead in doing that, what does that what does that mean for the global South? I mean, sure, we talked about very pertinent issues when you're talking about health, you're talking about COVID and all of that. But like, so you worked with ASEAN. Within the ASEAN countries itself, India is working, let's say, with the Quad, right? And then there is, of course, the ASEAN group of nations, which have kind of their own priorities. I guess my question really is, how much does the global South need India to amplify their voice? Uh, and how much we are thinking through kind of our own perspective.
Should we take a couple more and then we'll go on? Oh, no, I'm keeping a note of those. Anyone else, please? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Catherine from the Australian High Commission. I had a couple of questions, just quick ones. Firstly, Ambassador, you were saying how the utility of regional groupings and organizations is declining. I'm just wondering how you square that with India's increasing priorities on regional institutions, for example, the Quad and the G20. And then I'm also interested in your perspectives on India's long-term outlook on its multi-alignment strategy, with its heavy involvement in many regional institutions, strong bilateral relationships with US, Russia, and Global South agenda. How will India manage all of those equities with all those countries and groupings in the long term? Thanks.
Thank you. So there are two questions about the Quad. So first, the Quad is not an institution. It is just a Quad. And you asked about Quad and ASEAN. So I'm going to come to that. So the Quad and ASEAN, you will see that they will come closer and closer. The President Joko Widodo already said so. The Philippines Foreign Minister last week said so. That there is no contradiction. But so that hesitation of working with Quad is gone. Who made this possible? India. The Indian voice in Quad, in keeping the military part quiet, raising the functional aspects, which you see dominate the Quad summit statement, is what is persuading ASEAN that we are benign and we are not asking them to choose sides. But wider than that, three things which India did for bringing the global South up. One, it did it during its G20 presidency. So it was in a position to articulate what they heard there. Second, they consulted 125 countries who had never been consulted before on the G20 agenda. So this was the democratization of the G20. Every country believes that in the United Nations they are heard. It is evident that they all feel they are not. So this time they felt they were heard, and I think all these working groups, from what I have seen, what came out of the Voice of Global South Summit, I see it coming in different places. Regarding now, the G20 also is not an institution in the same sense of regional institution. By regional institution, I mean ASEAN, African Union, the CARICOM, stuff like that. But I think you have pointed out we have good relations with everybody. And frankly, we wanted good relations with China. It is the Chinese who busted that. Had the Chinese not busted that, we would have been in an even better position of being omni-friendly to everybody. They are the ones who are putting a cleavage on us and then making countries choose that are you going to side with India, the Quad, this, that. And I think with the help of Australia, Japan, the USA, we are playing a persuasive role within the global south that we are not the bad guys and we can be a force for good. So I think that is the message. India as a force for good for the global south. Thank you.
Will you answer all questions? Yeah, please. Elizabeth, yeah.
Ambassador, I just wanted to ask, you sort of prepared us now to accept that there is going to be no final communique as in a joint communique, right? I mean, is that what you've prepared us for?
It's your question.
I have prepared myself for that. And I've only shared that perception with you. I don't know what will happen. But to my mind, having a communique or having a chair statement, no difference. Does anybody remember that at the last East Asia summit, Cambodia could not have a common communique? They actually went with a chair statement. Who remembers? In my career, we have signed so many agreements and so many MOUs. Legally, they are not the same. The intent is the same. Why do you do it? Because, very often treaties have to go through parliaments, MOUs don't. You take the easy way out. Just get the work done.
So, sorry, can I just add a question to you? So, what would make, according to you, what would make the G20 New Delhi summit a success, if you were to look at it?
I think it should rain on 9 September.
Yeah, good evening, everybody, and I'm so happy to be here and to listen, to learn few of the things. I have two things. One which my own belief, one which is coming from outside. My own belief has been for the last 5 years, I have always said that India has a tremendous asset and then tremendous also respect from other countries to be accepted very easily, both in terms of investments or whatever cooperation that could happen with I would say, the developing countries. So that's my personal belief. When it comes to the global south, people also ask, because when you see the voice, it's like a spokesperson, it's like somebody, a mandate. So now the question which comes, has India gathered enough mandate to speak on behalf of the global south? Has the agenda of India is the same with, for instance, let's say Brazil? Has it be the same like South Africa? Has it be the same like Morocco? Because there are disparities, and then priorities differ from one to the other. We had only one priority, that was health at the time of COVID, and then it has also shown us how unified we could be if there is a strong political will, or if the nature pushes us to be unified. So now the simple question, when you see the global south, it's not less than 140 countries probably. And then in that percentage, has the summits, or did the summits which the Prime Minister organized with different ministerial meetings had enough of the mandates, of the voices for the people to say, speak about us? And then when we say the voice of the South, is it the priorities of India, for instance, brought up with the others, or is it the others' priorities which are voiced for them? Thank you.
I give you the shot and then I'll also, you obviously have the final word, but actually you want to come in with this?
Okay. I just want to answer the last part. Whose priorities? My understanding is that as the G20 chair, India is certainly pushing its own priorities. But after the Voice of Global South Summit, which incidentally was not part of the G20 process, it was our effort to consult our friends in the Global South. We have brought viable aspects of that into the working groups of different levels. So those priorities, but certainly Indian priorities. Where they match, stronger. Where they don't match, weaker. But that is the reality. Other than that, what you say, I agree with you. I mean, I have no issue with what you say. I only wish that Brazil and South Africa continue this push to consult the global south and consolidate it as G20 chair. It'll be worthwhile. India will consolidate it for its own goals after G20. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just add, it is a unique moment in time, like Ambassador had said earlier, from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and then South Africa, and also G7 led by Japan. Um, Global North and Global South agenda tend to be different. Global South has a context that's similar. It is time for Global South to think hard about South-South cooperation. Irrespective of who's the voice of Global South, knowledge, exchange, as well as solutions that need to be exchanged to advance growth, to advance development. I don't think that there's a better time than this right now. And especially given the context of COVID, given the context of conflict, and also climate, which tends to be inequitable, I think Global South should think and collaborate, advancing its own agenda as well, which can be different from Global North.
It takes me to another possibility of just for debates, because of course, the role of G of 77 plus China is, we know, fading because of it has a little bit aging like in organization. Is the Global South a replacement somehow? Or if we don't say replacement, is it going to be evolved into a certain kind of organization that will speak our priorities? I'm not speaking in the short terms, immediate, or the medium or the long terms. Thank you.
Before you get on to that, I just wanted to put on this point that the Global South today is definitely the biggest part of the world economy. The combined GDP of these four is now bigger than the G7, the BRICS 4. And if you look at any issue that is going to come up in this decade and the next, this is the place where every one of the issues would be figuring. In that context, should we be, I mean, are we being too ambitious in saying there's a global south? Or is it time to say that, there are variations, there are patterns, there are, different shades of gray in terms of even looking at this particular branch of kind of economies?
I think there are 50 shades of gray. And I don't think Global South will become an institution. Actually, our institutions don't work ever. No, NAM, where is it today? India did not kill it. G77 in China, what does it do? So much depends on the chair of that time. What has happened to many of these institutions or groupings, let's call them groupings, is that various people became enthusiastic to chair them for their own limited ends. At least now India is showing, as I said, a voice for global good through the G20. That is the initiative. India should use this to refurbish its credentials in a global south where China is the dominant player. China is hedging India's rise. We cannot challenge China in many ways, but there are many ways we can. In Africa, I was always told China does more, but India does better. There is that better element. It is smaller but better. That is what we need to expand with whoever is ready. And that will be the alternative to China, because we don't want a world dominated by China or to go by what they call their rules-based order. That is what we need to use the global south for. Now, how South Africa and Brazil use it, will India play a more active troika role by activating that? This remains to be seen. But I think that is where I would see the global south going. Thank you.
And I think India's credentials in terms of accelerating development are pretty, and also how it thinks about, working with countries genuinely, advancing development is pretty critical. Not necessarily, using financing, using debt and other instruments. It is rooted in helping countries.
One thing I forgot to say at the beginning was just a housekeeping thing, that if there was an on any online provision for an online thing, but I don't think there would be anything. But meanwhile, Anya, I think we're running out of time, so we would be the last word belongs to you. My thanks to the panel, that we have, despite all the pressures of the South and North, we have kept our unity and harmony, and that's something to feel very nice in this fractured world. So I think a round of applause on that note for having, and thanks a lot for having joined us. Thank you very much to Ananta Center for having organized this. Thank you.
What about Ananya? Really?